Hey y'all, it's Ashley Bookishrealm. I'm back with another video. So clearly this is going to be an interesting video. I have 40 YA books that I think you should read before you die. This is not in direct response to the reaction that Bethany and I did, Bethany from Beautifully Bookish Bethany, that we did to the Times top 100 YA books of all time. I think that I want to do something along those lines, but right now I don't feel like I'm well read enough in a lot of backlist stuff to make a definitive list like that. Hopefully within the next year I can do it, but for right now I don't necessarily feel 100% confident doing something along those lines because some of the older stuff I have not read, and I want to touch on some stuff that's probably a lot less popular, not necessarily indie, but stuff that was coming out in like 2007, 2008 that's not super well known. It is interesting because I have some stuff that I'm doing for work that's kind of related to that, so I'm seeing some titles come up that I'm not as familiar with that I actually do want to get my hands on and kind of read. So these are just 40 YA books that I think that you should read before you die. Now I'm going to go ahead and preface this by saying that this list is going to be skewed for a variety of different reasons. When it comes to young adult, and mostly I think just in general, I read a lot of like literary fiction, contemporary, realistic fiction, those hard-hitting impactful books. Not saying that science fiction, fantasy, or anything outside of that genre can't be, but it's going to be heavily skewed in that direction because I'm only going to rec you books that I've read. I do not believe in wrecking books that I have not read, so that's how my reading is skewed. So this list is going to kind of be biased in that direction. I do have some SFF, but not as much in terms of like a well-balanced list of SFF versus, you know, other genres or whatever the case may be. You're also going to find that a lot of the stuff that I'm including on this list is newer. I didn't really start tracking my reading until about 2014, so off the top of my head, I don't really remember everything that I have read. There are some things that I think I have read, but I can't be 100% sure because I didn't track it and it would have been a long time ago, and I have no idea whether that's just kind of a fleeting thought and whether I'm just familiar with the title and I'm trying to associate it with the fact that I have read it. So you're going to see a lot of this is going to be heavily within the realm, I think, of like in between 2017 to 2021. So you're going to see a lot of front list stuff instead of a lot of backlist stuff. I will also say that it's going to be biased because this is not going to be like the best YA books of all time. This is my personal best list of books that I think you should pick and choose from and read some of these before you die. So that's just a kind of a preface because I don't want anybody to think like, oh, well, Ashley made this list and it's not well balanced. I know, honey, I know it's not well balanced going into it. So just to kind of give you a heads up, I'm not going to do a whole lot of talking about every single book because it's 40 books and I just uploaded an hour and 20-minute my wrap up. That was a beast to edit. Those are always a beast to edit. So these are not going to be reviews. I have reviewed all of these books at some point on this channel. Where they're located on this channel, I could not possibly tell you. Some of them are going to be a little easier to identify because I've talked about them so much on this channel, but others I've only talked about a handful of times. So yeah, and some of them are in videos that are no longer on the channel. So that makes things kind of interesting. But we're going to go ahead, we're going to jump into the list, and I hope you enjoy. If there are books that you think I should try out, let me know. This list is probably going to be interesting for a lot of people because you're not going to see stuff like, believe it or not, like The Hate You Give is not on there, Dear Martin's not on this list, Sarah J. Maas is not on this list, Cassandra Clare is not on this list. So a lot of what you probably are super familiar with or what has been super popular in terms of YA is not going to be here. I think a lot of these, well, some of these are well known. There are a handful of these that are super well known or they're making their rounds right now on the BookTube community, but for the most part, you know, people have talked about them, but they're not getting like super a lot of buzz. But okay, I think that's it. I'm done with the intro. Let's go ahead and jump into this list. Okay, so the first one that I have on this list is Monster by Walter Deaton Myers. And I just felt it was necessary to include Walter D. Myers on this list. He is one of the most pivotal individuals in terms of what YA is now, and I definitely say that in terms of like how he's inspired Black writers who are writing YA and even some middle grade. He's one of the OGs, and Monster is not one of my favorites by him, but I think that it is such an important text, and you're probably going to hear me say that a lot about a lot of these books, that I feel like they're super important in terms of like what messaging they're sending out. I think Monster was a little difficult for me because it's an unreliable narrator. It is a young Black boy that is on trial, and I'm going to leave it at that because I don't want to give too much away about this one. And I believe that Netflix already has an adaptation of this one. I probably should reread the book and then watch the adaptation, but I'm always wary about adaptations because they never go right. The next one that I have is by another OG author, and this is Copper Sun by Sharon Draper. Sharon Draper is such a joy. I had the pleasure of meeting her a few years ago. Actually, it probably was about 3 years ago at this point, and she's just a gem. I've read a few of her books. She has other young adult series outside of Copper Sun. This is a standalone, and this is a slave narrative, but it is done in such a interesting and fascinating way. There are dark parts of it, but for the most part she doesn't go all the way, meaning like a lot of the scenes are either like insinuated or they're fade to black. But if you're looking for a very interesting historical fiction piece geared towards a young adult audience, I would check out Copper Sun. The next one that I have on my list may be a surprise to some people, but it's A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness, and this one was really popular when it first came out, and it was on BookTube, making its rounds on BookTube, and everybody read it. And what I did appreciate is that people were reading it and they did not spoil it. So I went into A Monster Calls completely blind. I recommend going into it completely blind if you have not read this book yet. But I wanted to add this one to my personal list of ones that I think people should read, is because it handles grief in a very interesting way. And of course, it's from the perspective of a child and how he's handling this process of grief and how he's going to deal with it in the future. And Patrick Ness does a very good job with it. I believe that this story actually was originally started by someone else, and Patrick Ness finished it, and he did an excellent job in finishing it. So A Monster Calls, there's a movie adaptation of A Monster Calls as well. I've seen it. I can't remember if I liked it or not, but there is a movie adaptation. The next one that I have on this list is This Is My America by Kim Johnson. This is one that I talked about a lot last year, and the reason why I talked about this one so much last year is because we often hear and read a lot about mass incarceration and just the judicial system and how it does not always benefit everyone. We know for a fact that it doesn't benefit everyone, but this one specifically I really enjoyed because it is about mass incarceration, but it's about how it impacts the family members that are left behind. So it focuses on a main character whose father is on death row, and she's trying to actively get in touch with this organization that would help her father get off of death row, and at the same time her brother's life begins to mirror her father's life. So there's some mysterious elements to it, some thrillery type elements to it as well, and this is one that I raved about last year. So if you haven't gotten the chance to read this one, I highly recommend it, and that cover is beautiful. The next one that I have on this list is Solo by Kwame Alexander. I had the pleasure of meeting and actually interviewing Kwame Alexander this year, and it was so much fun. I wish it was something that I could have recorded and shared, but it wasn't that type of situation, and he is a gem of a human. It was like sitting down and having coffee with a friend. He was super chill, super laid back, and this was the first book that I ever read by Kwame Alexander. He's mostly known for his book The Crossover, and The Crossover for me is kind of like, it can be either middle grade or YA depending upon how you kind of look at the content, but he's most well known for The Crossover. I loved Solo, which is definitely for a YA audience, and it is really heavily focused on not just this musical element, but also family dynamics and knowing where you come from in your history. And I thought it was well done. I recommend listening to Solo on audio because the musical elements that are incorporated into the book are actually like there in the audiobook, like there's singing and actual music that you can hear, and it made the book really, really great. So if you haven't read Kwame Alexander in general, he has a lot of stuff to check out in terms of like YA backlist. The next one that I have on my list is Genesis Begins Again by Alicia D. Williams. Now, this is another one I think that technically it is categorized often as middle grade, but I think there's some content in it that can push it a little bit towards like the lower end of YA. It's one of those crossover titles where it's like it can go in either place depending upon who's reading it. And I did a full review on this one when I read The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, and I also read a picture book, and all three of them deal heavily with colorism and white passing. And I decided to pick this one up and did not expect it to be so hard hitting. It focuses, of course, on Genesis. She's struggling a lot with her complexion, her hair, this even conversation about texturism. So she's struggling with her hair texture. There's a lot of content warnings in terms of like how she views herself, how her family treats her, specifically her grandmother, and trying to reinforce the idea that lighter skin is better, which generational trauma at play definitely here. And she has a parent that is dealing with alcoholism. So this is an intense book, but if you're looking for a middle grade / YA book that deals heavily with topics related to colorism and texturism, I highly recommend this one. The next one that I have here is Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. Jason Reynolds also has an extensive backlist of YA titles that you can check out. I've read about half of his bibliography, still making my way through it. I took a break, don't know why, but I will make it through all of his stuff, trust me. But Long Way Down is one of my favorites by Jason Reynolds, just because of like the beauty of the story that he tells in this. And it's about a young man who has just lost his brother to gang violence. He's trying to determine basically whether he's going to get revenge for his brother's death. And this all takes place across an elevator ride from his floor to the bottom floor. So time is an interesting concept in this book because time is not what you think it is, and I don't want to say too much, but Jason Reynolds writes a beautiful author's note at the end of this in which he explains why he talked about kids, specifically black kids, being involved in gangs, and how that cycle of being gang members and being involved in gang violence, how that just keeps going and going and going, because it's older generations that keep passing on these arguments and these violent confrontations from one group to another. And he actually spent time with some kids, I believe, that were in Jube, and just got to know them and hear their stories, and he ended up writing this book. I have read this book probably about 3 times. I haven't always like made a note of when I've read it, but I've read it at least 3 times, and there's something about the ending that I can't get, so I'm gonna keep reading it until I figure it out. The next one that I have on this list is Heroin by Mindy McGinnis. I'm actually about to reread this one probably within the next week or so. Heroin was a surprise for me. This is the only Mindy McGinnis book that I have read, and I did not realize how intense the book was going to be, because as you can see from the cover, you know, you could think of it as like heroin, like the drug, or like the heroine of a novel. And it really is about a teenage girl that struggles with heroin addiction that stem from opioid addiction. So we are really getting a story that mirrors the current opioid crisis that's happening in America, where people get prescribed opioids for injuries. The main character is actually in a car accident, and she gets prescribed opioids, and things just kind of go downhill from there. And it really looks at the dynamics of how people's chemical makeup, like your brain chemical makeup, it varies so much, because someone can take opioids and be perfectly fine and not deal with addiction, and then you have someone who takes an opioid, and it's like a trigger gets set off in their brain and they get addicted to the pills, and then they start looking for something stronger, which typically ends up being heroin. This book is dark. I will go ahead and say it. It's not an easy read. The main character hits rock bottom. I mean, literally plummets into chaos. So I would prepare myself for that before picking that one up. The next one I have here is Parachutes by Kelly Yang. This was one of my favorite books of 2020. I believe this was either in the top 3 or top 5 books of 2020. And oh my gosh, y'all, Parachutes is amazing. First of all, Kelly Yang is amazing. Everything that I've read by Kelly Yang, I have given 5 stars. So her middle grade series, the next one is actually coming out this month. Super excited about that. But this is her YA debut, and it focuses on 2 students, and they are going to this school and they live 2 very different lives, but there are some very complex themes that bring them together. This definitely has content warnings for sexual assault as well as grooming by an adult figure, and so I would be mindful of that. This is also not an easy one to read. The cover is, in my mind, very misleading, because this cover looks like it's going to be cute and fluffy, and it's anything but. And if you do read this book, I implore you to read the author's note afterwards, because Kelly Yang explains where she got the inspiration from to write this book, and it is gut-wrenching. So if you have been considering reading Kelly Yang and you're not a huge fan of middle grade, I would recommend picking up Parachutes. I was supposed to say Paper Shoes. It's definitely Parachutes. The next one that I have on this list is Speak by Lori Halse Anderson. This is such an important book to the history of YA. It specifically deals with sexual assault and a teen that's trying to figure out how to use or possibly not use her voice in a certain situation, and that's why it's titled Speak. I don't want to say too much about it. There is a movie adaptation of this one that stars whatever the woman's name is, Kristen Stewart. Yeah, it stars her. It was like a made for TV thing. I don't recommend that, but I do recommend picking up this book. As a matter of fact, within the past couple of years, Lori Halse Anderson wrote another book called Shout, which is in direct response to Speak. Speak often gets challenged and banned in schools and libraries, but it's so good. I definitely recommend it. I could not make this list without including Forever by Judy Blume. This is one of those early YA novels that just, it's super, super great. It is above and beyond its time. It was published, I believe, in 75. Don't quote me on that, but I believe it was published in 1975, and it deals heavily with teenage sexuality. And for a lot of people, it was their first time seeing something like that in a book where the main characters were teenagers, and it's so openly discussed and so positively discussed. And of course, as a result, Forever is definitely challenged and banned quite a bit because of its content, but I could not make this list without adding this book. It was going to be between Forever or Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. I believe that's such a long title, but I believe that that's the title. It's going to be between those two, but I think Forever for me, just because of how complex it is in terms of the moves that it was making in YA, I had to include that one. I had to include this book, To All the Boys I Loved Before by Jenny Han. So I read this book when I was younger. I was an adult. I was in my 20s, and it was my first time really reading a lot of like YA contemporary romance, and I loved it. I reread it this year, and it only stood up to be like a 3.5 star read for me, but I wanted to include this, like, if you haven't read it, because Jenny Han makes some very, very big leaps and bounds with the publication of To All the Boys I Loved Before, this positive representation of an Asian main character in a young adult book. We're talking about times when representation just was not that good. I mean, representation is still not technically good when we think about youth literature, but during this time it was not good at all. So for her to have written a book that is not just solely focused on the romantic elements, but also these family dynamics and what it's like for Laura Jean and her being an Asian character. It definitely was making big moves, and it is one of my favorite YA contemporary romance series. And although I think for me, being older now, it won't necessarily hold up, I also am willing to acknowledge that that's because I am not the target age demographic for these books. I love the movies, and they're extremely different from the books. They definitely made some serious adjustments to make it for, you know, Netflix, but I think that you can still get the same appreciation. And I think that people within this target age group will really continue to love and appreciate it. I would be foolish. It would just be pure like foolishness if I didn't include Ace of Spades. There's not really much that I want to say about Ace of Spades because I think Ace of Spades speaks for itself. It is such a great dark academia thriller, two black characters, and they're going to this boarding school, and this weird Ace character starts revealing pieces about their lives, and there's this huge plot that gets revealed, and it definitely has a slower pacing to it, but that's what makes the book so great. Definitely has Get Out vibes. I cannot praise this book enough. It is one of my favorites of 2021. I ate it up. I cannot wait to reread it. If you have not picked up Ace of Spades yet, or if it's on your TBR, like, move it up. Go ahead and just move it up. The next one that I have on my list is a nonfiction book, and that is The 57 Bus. I talked about this one a little bit. I believe it was on the Times Top 100. If it wasn't, it should have been. And this is an interesting book because it does a few things. It focuses on an incident that happened on the 57 bus where a teen was set on fire. Their dress was set on fire because of their gender identity and another kid not understanding. And what the writer of this is attempting to do is not validating the thing that happens, the assault that happens, but they dig deep into what happens to these two kids after the fact. And you have one kid that is, I believe, they're white, and then another kid who is black, and what happens when that black kid ends up going through the judicial system, and how skewed and biased the judicial system is, and how he's questioned and how he's led into answers. It gets really interesting, and it's looking at the story from a complete lens and not just one-sided. So if you haven't read The 57 Bus, it's definitely one that you need to check out. The next one that I have is another nonfiction book, and it's Concrete Kids, which is part of Penguin's Pocket Book Change Books. And Concrete Kids was interesting for me because it talks about the author's experience and growing up in this neighborhood and not being able to live outside of this neighborhood, not really being able to get experiences outside of this neighborhood. And it talks about so many difficult things that these kids face. Racism, there's commentary on the AIDS epidemic. It's so much, and I will say there's a lot of content warnings for this because the writer of it does have some issues that occur while they're growing up, and I'm trying to kind of tiptoe because I don't want to say too much with a lot of these because I don't want to spoil them. But if you haven't read Concrete Kids, I would check that out too. I had to include a Tiffany D. Jackson, and I'm gonna go with Grown, even though I just read White Smoke. Grown was a phenomenal book for me last year. It is a thriller. You know, Tiffany D. Jackson is doing her thing with mysteries and thrillers and what she's been writing and what she continues to write. I just recently found out that she actually has a Halloween picture book releasing next month, which I think is awesome. But this, I have a full review on this, and any like of these books that I've done like full reviews on, or I know what videos include these books, I will try to include them. But this book particularly it's interesting because while it's not definitively based off of what was happening with R. Kelly, you can tell that it's very reminiscent of what happens in the music industry, and a lot of that can be pulled from what R. Kelly is now going through as he goes through his trial. And it's about the treatment of young black women and young black girls and how they're not ever believed when things happen to them, traumatic situations. People have a tendency not to believe them. They brush it off and they're kind of chuck it up to whatever. And Tiffany D. Jackson has these thriller elements to it and still is able to make such heavy social commentary, and it's a nice balance, and I really love that. So I'm sure people have heard of Grown. I know a lot of people have read Grown, but if you haven't, you need to read it. Pick up White Smoke, pick up anything that Tiffany D. Jackson has written. The next one that I have on this list is We Are Not From Here by Jenny Torres Sanchez. This is one that broke my heart last year. It really tore me up. I actually listened to this on audio, and I remember I was cleaning the bathroom and I like broke down crying because it was just so heart-wrenching. And this book is about 3 teenagers who are leaving Guatemala City trying to come to the United States, and they're making this dangerous journey as teenagers, as kids. And what Jenny Torres Sanchez does is she humanizes an experience that a lot of people just kind of brush off their shoulders. And when people are so quickly to say, oh, they're undocumented and I don't want people and da-da-da-da, you know, all the nasty, horrendous things that people will say, not realizing why people are making this journey and why they're willing to risk their lives, because it's not an easy journey. It's not as simple as walking out your house and crossing a border. These kids face death at every turn, and it's what people in real life are going through. And by taking these experiences, translating them into a young adult perspective and putting it out there for teens and adults to read, it humanizes, I think, stories that people otherwise would not really look deep into. So be prepared when reading this one. The next one that I have on this list is One of Us Is Next by Karen McManus. Now, this technically is the second book in a duology. This is the second book in the One of Us Is Lying duology. The first one I gave like 3 stars to, but I would say read the first book just so you can get to the second one. There aren't a lot of mystery and thriller writers that I read that write for a young adult audience. Karen McManus is one of those authors. I've literally read everything that she has published thus far. And this one is probably my favorite because I literally did not see where anything was going. I thought I had the story figured out, and Karen McManus did a brilliant thing. Literally the whole concept of the entire book, not the concept, but the whole plot of what you thought had happened changed within the last 3 pages. Completely changed. And I was so mind blown because I would have never in a million years thought that what happened would have happened. It was crazy. I remember reading those last 3 pages and my mouth literally had dropped. So if you're looking for another mystery thriller writer, Karen McManus is one to check out. I think that she has good range, so she has a little bit of appeal for everyone, but this is definitely one of my favorites from her. The next one that I have on this list is Raybearer by Jordan E. Fueco. This was one of my favorites from last year as well, and I just read the sequel to the end of the duology, which was Redemptor, and I just talked about this, the second one, in my wrap up, with which is up and live. And okay, this is one of the best duologies that I've ever read, so I didn't want to put Redemptor on here because it's the second book. Clearly, I think that Raybearer is worth reading. I've done a standalone review for this one. I am tempted to do a standalone review for Redemptor to talk about it a little bit more, but Raybearer is such a phenomenal book. It's so good. The concept behind it, the magic system, the world building. I mean, Jordan E. Fueco is just a really talented writer. So if you haven't read the Raybearer duology, even though I'm holding up Raybearer, you need to read the Raybearer duology because it's just fascinating. The next one that I have is The Diviners by Libba Bray, and I'm holding this one up because this one is not my favorite in the series. It's good. It's a really great start to a series, and I think that Libba Bray does a lot of good things with these books in terms of like her cast of characters, the diversity, the topics that she covers. But if I'm not mistaken, I believe the third book, When the Devil Breaks You, is probably my favorite because of how she addresses what the country is like at the time that Donald Trump first gets elected. And it's very interesting reading that book. She includes a lot of historical things in her books, like this one. I believe that this one addresses the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's either this one or it's the second book, but she touches on a lot of the discriminatory policies that the US had in place during this time. A lot of authors would write a story during this time period and glaze over the reality of what the country was like, and she doesn't do that. This is paranormal, it's fantasy, but she refuses to not acknowledge the things that would be happening with her characters because it takes place in this time, and I really, really appreciate that. I know a couple people don't necessarily enjoy the Diviners because they don't like Evie as the main character, but I also say, like, Evie is obnoxious. I said this in my review because I read this one in August. Evie is obnoxious. She's not the easiest person to get along with, but the beauty of that is that Libra Bray creates a wide range of characters that everyone can enjoy, so it's not solely just being told from Evie's perspective. And yeah, I didn't give a summary of this one. It takes place in 1920s, a group of teens that have these special abilities, and they're trying to stop this man who is creating this ritual to resurrect himself and basically bring hell to earth. I don't know how else to sell it to you. If that wasn't a good sell, then I don't know what I'm doing with myself. The next one I have on my list is Fat Chance Charlie Vega, and this one was really interesting to me because it was kind of like a twofold story where we have a discussion about positive body representation and fat representation in a character that's dealing with being comfortable in her own skin, but there's also a lot of like conversation related to how relationships affect friendships and how not to lose yourself in a relationship and how to find that balance and be confident in yourself. I thought it was really, really good for what it was setting itself up to be, even though I didn't expect it to kind of be this multi-layered twofold story. I thought it was going to specifically just focus on like the positive body representation and, you know, being comfortable in your skin, but it went beyond that, and I really appreciated that. This is a newer one that came out, I believe, February of this year. The next one I have is another new release for this year, and it's a pho love story, and I talked about this one also in my recent wrap up. This is the first book that I've read that has delved heavily into the Vietnamese or Vietnamese American experience, and while this is a contemporary romance that does focus on two characters, which is, it's like a play on Romeo and Juliet, who are not allowed to communicate with each other, it does so much more than that. I think that in reading this, you get full immersion into Vietnamese culture by language, discussion of food, but it also talks about the impact that the Vietnam War had on the Vietnamese community and what happened once they immigrated to the United States and how that's changed and impacted their life, which is something that I have not gotten out of a book before, so it was very, very well appreciated. Of course, I also could not make this list without including Alana the First Adventurer. I would not have read this book if it was not for Bethany from Beautifully Bookish Bethany. We actually did live shows for each one of the books, and this is another book published in the 80s, well before its time. This is a series that follows Alana from the time that she is a child up until she's an adult. It explores her sexuality. It explores just her navigating spaces with just a lot of men. Like, we really get to see her mature and grow up and become this amazing human, and it does things very, very well. Of course, there are some things that don't necessarily age well, but for the most part, this was before its time. She was doing stuff in fantasy that we are still trying to push for now, which is greatly appreciated. I know that she has made a lot of commentary. Bethany said that whenever she read the newer edition, she would always read like the author's note in the back, and you know, Tammy would always talk about, you know, well, these are a couple things that I would change because I've learned more about myself and about marginalized communities and what representation should look like. So even then, she's, you know, acknowledging how it could be better. But it's such a great series if you've never read it. I mean, really good fantasy series. The next one that I have on this list is The Awakening of Malcolm X. This is also another newly released title that just came out January of this year, and it focuses on Malcolm X's life as he is navigating his prison sentence, and it's a lot of interesting things that he goes through. You literally get to see his experience and how he starts to want to become a part of the Nation of Islam and how that affects his experience being in jail. You learn a lot of different things about his prison sentence that you may not know of. Like, I think most people know that he did end up going to jail, but I think a lot of people don't know like what happened while he was there, and when he came out he had already converted to the Nation of Islam. But just an amazing book. There's quotes for days in that book, quotes for days. I still need a physical copy myself and I don't have one. The next one that I have is Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. I mean, literally any Elizabeth Acevedo book could be on this list, but Clap When You Land is my favorite of hers, and I've read all three of her books. With The Fire on High is my least favorite, and I think that most people's favorite is The Poet X. But I really like Clap When You Land because of the sister dynamic. It was really, really great to see these two young girls bond over such a tragic event, which was the loss of their father. And I love that Elizabeth Acevedo took this time to bring light to the actual plane crash that did occur in real life, which most people have forgotten about, but it really, really, really impacted the Dominican community. And I think that it's kind of one of those disasters that's just left out, and I'm not going to get into specifics of why, but I think we can all kind of, you know, make some inference about that. So Clap When You Land, I think most people have heard of this. Most people have read Clap When You Land, but if you haven't read it, here it is. Next, I have Girls Like Us by Randy Pink, which is a lesser known book. Randy Pink is one of those authors I feel like flies under the radar. I have her newly released book that she did this year, which was Angel of Greenwood, which is about the Tulsa Massacre, and this year, of course, was the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. And I think that she does some really interesting things with historical fiction. Girls Like Us focuses on 4 young girls that are directly impacted by the inability to choose in terms of pregnancy, and this is before Roe v. Wade. So of course this is going to be pretty dark. It takes place in the late 60s, early 70s. I forget when Roe v. Wade was actually passed, but it's prior to that, and you get to see a lot of things. There's a lot of interesting things that relate to race when it comes to, you know, right to choose, and also class plays a big role as well. Next, I have The Astonishing Color of After, and I don't know if this one ever really got a lot of buzz on BookTube, but it is one of the most fascinating YA books that I've ever read, that I've ever read. And this one focuses a lot on mental health. It is a main character who loses her brother to suicide, and she ends up, I believe she goes to Taiwan in order to meet her family, and for her mom's side of the family, and she encounters some very interesting things there, and it really is circling grief and mental health awareness. Such a beautiful book. I'm not sure where my copy is. It's somewhere in here, but but I do need to reread that one soon. The next one that I have here is Salt to the Sea by Rita Sepetys. This is one of my favorite historical fiction books of all time for a YA audience, and the reason why I like this one so much is because it focuses on a different perspective of World War II. We are looking at individuals who are from Lithuania, and this focuses on one of the worst maritime disasters in history, and it takes place in World War II, and people don't know about it. People are often thinking about the Titanic, but this one I believe was actually worse than the Titanic, if I'm not mistaken. I think a lot of more people passed away, unfortunately, in this maritime disaster, and Rita Sepetys does a lot of great research, a lot of great character development. This is a book that made me big girl cry. I did a standalone review. I think it's still up on my channel, but I boohooed, like cried. It was such a heart-wrenching book. The next one that I have on this list is Drama High, The Fight. This is the first book in the Drama High series by Elle Devine, and I included this one on this list because this is one of the series that we get from Dafina where it is kind of street lit that has been condensed down in order to fit a teen audience. These books really did wonders for a lot of Black teens who were not able to get books on the market that were for them, that had characters that not only look like them, but I always say this, like, you can have a book that has Black characters written by a Black author and it's still written for the white gaze, meaning that your characters are doing things and saying things and carrying themselves in a way that would still be appealing to white readers. This series is not. This series is blackity black, black, black. And I think that during the time in which it was published, it was very much needed. And I think books like this are still needed. We are getting more books written by Black authors with Black characters. But every now and then, you know, we do end up getting books that are still written for the white gaze, like what makes white people feel comfortable. And Elle Devine did not do that. This was for Black kids by a Black author, where they were able to be their authentic selves, and see themselves in books, like for real, for real. So if you've never heard of the Drama High series, literally it's like drama, but they're cute. The next one that I have on this list is Under the Mesquite, and I included this one. This is a lesser known YA book, and I never would have come across this title had it not been for my YA lit class that I took when I was in library school. And Under the Mesquite is, you know, about a young girl by the name of Lapita who is responsible for taking care of her brothers and sisters, and it's a lot of them, because her mother gets sick with cancer and her father has to take her away for treatment. And it's about her navigating, like, I now am the adult of the house and I'm still a teenager myself. And I love that, not only because we were getting just like so much internal dialogue about her experience, but it's so real because for a lot of teenagers, that is their life, where, you know, their parents may have to work multiple jobs, or, you know, you have a parent that's caring for the other parent because they're sick, and the oldest teen or child would have to step up and take care of their siblings. And that still happens a lot to this day. And I think it's something that a lot of kids will be able to relate to. It was a great story. It's written in verse. I think this was published a while ago, but I haven't read it since like 2017. Yeah, about 2017, probably about fall of 2017, or at least spring of 2018, but it's well worth reading. The next one that I have is a graphic novel that is geared towards a YA audience, and it is Yummy Last Days of a Southside Shorty. This is another title that I would have never known about had it not been for my YA lit class. And Yummy is based on a true story about a young kid that gets caught up in gang violence, and it's heart-wrenching because he's in and out of jail at an extremely young age, and it looks at how he basically gets cornered into gang life and how the police treat him as a minor. It's awful. It's really, really sad because it does happen to a lot of kids where they're in and out of the system, and it's like, why is no one doing anything to help these kids? There are people who are doing as much as they can, but the system should not allow stuff like that to happen. Like, these are children, like they should be getting as much assistance as possible. So it definitely delves into that. Artwork is great. If you've never read it, I mean, go for it. The next one I have here is another popular one that I think a lot of people have read, and it's Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. This was one of my favorite books of last year as well. Now, this does have some interesting aspects of it where I think that people are really questioning some character relationships in this one. I'm not going to delve into that right now, but Legendborn for me is a standout because it handles grief very, very well, and you can tell that Tracy Deonn pulled a lot from her own personal experience in relationship to grief and how she wrote the characters in this book. It takes place in the South on UNC Chapel Hill's campus. There's a lot of historical research that went into this. I think it was beautifully done. I think how she handled Black trauma was done very, very well. It's not often done well, even by Black authors. It's not always done in a way that it should be done, but Tracy Deonn does it. It's amazing. I love this book. It's not everybody's favorite. I think there are now starting to become like a little bit more polarizing views about it depending upon who you talk to, but I loved it. I I can't wait for the second book. The next one is another nonfiction book, and it's How Dare the Sunrise. And I read this one a long time ago, but I thought it was an interesting autobiography because it looks at this young girl's experience leaving. I believe she was from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and she's going through these traumatic experiences, trying to find refuge somewhere, and she ends up being moved from, she's not in the Democratic Republic of Congo when they move. I can't remember where she went, where she became a refugee. And then I believe that the UN stepped in and was helping, and they moved her and her family to the United States, and they were so ill prepared. It's so ill prepared. Like, you know, it's a very interesting story because it looks at the fact that, like, you know, I think the United States can say, like, oh, we want to help refugees, we want to help. And then once they get here, it's kind of where the help stops. And some people may disagree with me on this, but coming from one country to another country and like having no assistance, it is a culture shock. Like, it is completely different. And I think that in her experience too, being labeled as Black and coming here is a whole different ball game in terms of like racism, discrimination, and also realizing that the American dream is not the American dream for all of us. Like, I think sometimes, I think that's changing now because of the way that information now travels and people are starting to see things for what they are. But for a long time, before information had so many different ways of traveling, I think people were very committed to this whole concept and idea of the American dream. And the American dream is not the American dream for everybody. And it's not, you know, something that comes to fruition for everybody. And I think that some people had expectations of what they thought America was going to be, and when they get here, they have no idea. Like, what is this? I didn't sign up for this. So this tackles it, and it's one that I haven't seen really anybody talk about or read, but it's one that I think is well worth giving a chance. Speaking of those themes related to the American dream, the next book that I have on this list is American Street by Ibi Zoboi. Ibi Zoboi, I think it's talked about a lot of times on BookTube in relation to Pride, which is her Pride and Prejudice retelling, which is one of my least favorites of her because I just didn't like the way that one was done. But American Street was amazing, and it is another one that looks at that whole concept of the American dream. You have a woman and her daughter who were coming from Haiti. Mother gets stopped at customs, so the daughter ends up having to go live with relatives. I believe she's in Detroit, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so she goes to Detroit's west side, and culture shock. The whole entire experience is a culture shock for her, but I think that the story itself is, it's so good. I wish more people have read American Street. This is another one that I need to reread. I read it when it first came out, and I read it in like 2 sittings. Next, I have The Gilded Ones by Namina Forna. I don't even feel like I need to say much about this. Like, this book has gotten a lot of buzz, but I think it is one that you need to read because you just need to read it based on Namina's experience growing up in Sierra Leone during the time of the Civil War. Definitely impacts this. Great fantasy. Loved it. Ate it up. That's all I'm going to say. I also wanted to include Kingdom of Souls, which I don't think a lot of people have necessarily read Kingdom of Souls, but this is also one of my favorite fantasies that I think a lot more people should read. I think that this is a denser fantasy than what people are expecting. I know people were trying to compare it to Children of Blood and Bone, but it's not. This book stands on its own, and this has a sequel now called Reaper of Souls, which I have not read yet, but this I loved. I really loved. Next, I have Fallen Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes. This is one of my favorite young adult fantasies. This is often marketed, or when it was first came out, it was pushed as like the young adult Game of Thrones. Absolutely agreeing. So complex world building. You don't trust anybody, told from 3 different perspectives. A lot of interesting magic systems in this. I am so sad though, because so this series itself is 6 books, and it was supposed to have a spin-off series, and the spin-off series could not get its final book because they weren't getting enough numbers in terms of selling her books. They weren't getting high enough numbers, so they didn't feel like they had the justification to allow her to publish the third book, which is so sad because the third book would have been published after the sixth book, and it would have tied up loose ends from this initial series. But if you're interested in like fantasy that's reminiscent, maybe, no, I won't even say reminiscent of Game of Thrones. When I say Game of Thrones, I don't mean the messiness of Game of Thrones in like some of the content, but like the political intrigue of Game of Thrones is very evident in this as well. I also couldn't make this list without including A Wrinkle in Time. Of course, this was first published in the 60s, but I also think that it is a huge part of what YA looks like in terms of science fiction. I think everyone is pretty much familiar with A Wrinkle in Time. There have been so many adaptations of it. People talk about it all the time, but I could not make this list without including it. The second to last book that I have is Daughters of Jubilation, and this is one that I felt like never got enough buzz. This was also a favorite read for me last year, and I feel like it just wasn't marketed well, but this one is also interesting because it is fantastical in ways. Our main character does have some type of powers called the Jube. I can't tell you where the powers come from. I don't even want to tell you what they do, but it takes place, it's got to be in the 60s, and it's a lot of interesting family dynamics and why these black women have been gifted with this power called Jube. I think a lot more people need to read it. I still don't think it has that many reviews on Goodreads. I actually was able to sell it so well to my dad that he ended up asking me to get him a copy for Christmas, and he has been reading it. Granted, it was Christmas last year, but he's not a reader. And the fact that he asked me for a book was enough for me. And the last one that I included on this list is one that I literally just finished. It came out within the past 2 or 3 months, and it's Sugartown Queens. And the reason why I decided to include this one, it was kind of a last minute decision, and I still haven't even reviewed this on my Goodreads yet. But Sugartown Queens is one that I feel like also is not going to get a lot of play or a lot of promotion, and it's different in a good way because Sugartown Queens looks at family dynamics and what it means to be biracial in South Africa. And it's not the easiest read because there's a lot of emotional things that happen in it, but it looks at the remnants of apartheid and how it still impacts the black community and how difficult it may be for someone to be biracial living in South Africa because you have yourself caught literally between two worlds. I feel like there are some hardcore lines that are drawn when being South African and biracial, and your existence would not have been legal at one point. So I was interested in seeing this book when I had already, like years ago, read Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime, in which he was born in South Africa, biracial, and it literally was illegal for him to exist. And we don't get that element in this book, but we do get family dynamics and cultural dynamics that make it very, very hard for our main character because of the fact that she is biracial. She doesn't feel like she fits anywhere. She doesn't feel black enough. She doesn't feel white enough. And I think that those specific elements of the book taking place in South Africa with South African characters makes it even more complex. So if you've never heard of Sugartown Queens, I will be talking about this one more when I do my September wrap up, but I thought I would add it to this list. All right, y'all, so those are 40 YA books that I think you should read before you die. I said I wasn't going to talk a lot about these books. That was a complete lie. I should have known that it was going to be a complete lie. I don't know why I said, oh yeah, I'm not going to do that. I knew I was going to do it. That's why this video is so long. But anyway, let me know in the comments below if you've read any of these books, if you're interested in reading them. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more content from me, click the subscribe button, hit the bell for notification. Interested in following me on social media, supporting this channel, all the links will be down in the description box below. And I'll be back with another video soon. Bye.